Hi, I'm Bob Alphin, K4UEE, and I'm speaking to you from my home in Marietta, Georgia, USA. I'm in the process of narrating a PowerPoint presentation on the 3Y0Z DXpedition that had to abort its mission earlier this year. This is a presentation that I did at the DX Forum in Dayton, and just last weekend I gave the same presentation again at W5DXCC in Dallas. As I mentioned, it's about 3Y0Z, the ill-fated DXpedition that we had to abort and were unable to complete earlier this year. My purpose is to give you a fair and balanced account of the events that led up to the abort and give you a better understanding of those circumstances. With the help of Gary, KN4AQ, we're going to record this and put it up on YouTube. That way you can watch it individually, or your DX club can watch it as a group, or maybe it can be shown at a HamFest or a DX convention of some kind. In any case, I hope you enjoy it, I hope you learn something from it, and I am confident that you will. Thank you so very much. The plan is to talk about the 3Y0Z story, and I'm going to tell that story with what I believe are some rather extraordinary photos. Most of them, well, they all came from the team, but most of them came from my good friend Nodir, Echo Yankee 8 Mike. Very, very good photographer. So the plan for today is to tell the story, discuss our due diligence, or some people refer to it as vetting process. In other words, how did we pick the boat? And then we'll talk about what we've learned from this experience. We'll discuss whether we're going to make another attempt and what the decisions are that we've got to make before we do that. We are planning a refund of our remaining money or funds that are in our accounts to all of those who contributed. And then I'd like to conclude with some personal observations. So let's get started. On the relatively few periods of time when you could see the island, it was rather magnificent. We were so close, at sometimes probably not more than a half a mile offshore, but the expedition was just not to be. You may find this slide somewhat self-serving. I know that it makes me feel better, but my point is that after a long string of successes, maybe we were due for a failure. These are all in the top 10 or 12 most wanted, DXCC most wanted. I will note that in two cases, both of them in the Antarctic region, it took 2 attempts. I think it's important that everybody understands that there are a number of stakeholders, contributors that played a role in pulling together the money necessary to do this. The team members had a huge investment. Their travel expenses were somewhere between $2,500 and $4,000, depending upon which part of the world they were coming to Chile. Just to be on the team, if invited, was another $18,500. And then because this is a part of the world that many people have never visited and requires a different kind of clothing, they've got a substantial investment in the cost of that clothing. Each team member, somewhere between $24,000 as much as $30,000. And that's, talk about the investment, that's not including 31 days at sea in the Southern Ocean. The first 3 nights we spent in a nice hotel, but the boat wasn't ready, had not completed all of the sea trials, did not have all of the permits, and the only other option we could find was a not so nice hotel, more of a hostel than a hotel. The name was the Yellow Submarine. Of course, there was many different team pictures. This one was taken in the main square of Punta Arenas, Chile. The first couple of days that we were there, we underwent 2 full days of crew training and safety training. And here we are discussing the vessel itself. Again, very organized. This fellow on the left, by the way, is Alejo. Alejo works for the transportation contractor, DAP. We all got a review, or some people for the first time, not a review, but instead instructions on how to do CPR. We also launched the Zodiac to make sure we knew how that was done properly. And then we suited up in these exposure suits, sometimes called Gumby suits, and then enjoyed a dip in the rather chilly ocean. We also did some firefighting training. This is a real fire hose with a real nozzle. Well, finally, the day came when we could board. This is on the 18th of January, 5 days later than we had anticipated. All the permits now received. The vessel has been approved and ready to go. This is one of our first views of the vessel. They have taken the name DAP and converted it to Developing Antarctic Projects, because that's what the vessel basically is going to do. DAP is essentially in the aircraft flying business. They own 16 helicopters, a number of a C-130 or two, a number of passenger aircraft, and one of their main businesses is flying people over the Drake to King George Island. Another shot of the vessel, 200 plus feet long and well equipped. It was built in the 70s, but had just been renovated with about $2.5 million in terms of total costs. Again, some more shots on board. These are life rafts. There are 3 on the starboard side, 3 on the port side, and I believe they're I think they're 20-man life rafts. So on whatever side, there are enough life rafts or enough space in life rafts for 60 people. So for 120 people. Some more shots of interest. A good shot of the twin helicopters. These are Eurocopter BO-105s. Here we are departing. This is the next morning now, so January 19th. This is a tracker that Hal Turley, W5DXCC, brought along with him, and you can see that we are now departing out in a northeasterly direction. That is the direction of the Straits of Magellan. Were we excited? Yes, we were. Another team, couple of team members showing that excitement. The fellow on the left is Michael, PA5M, and on the right is my good friend Erling, LA6 Victor Mike. What we're doing here is moving the 14 HamCom amplifiers out of their cardboard boxes. And we're moving them to some custom-made plywood boxes that DAP had manufactured for us. The interior was, particularly in the passenger department, was really quite nice. There were 10 rooms with 4 bunks each, so they could carry 40 passengers. This what is turned out to be the area where we watched movies every night. We also held all of our team meetings. And then this was a third area also in the passenger section, and we turned this into our communications room. You can see that this is where we had set up 2 of the maritime mobile stations. We're using flex radios. The first time a major DXpedition has used flex radios, and we erected a vertical on the bow of the ship. That's me on the left, and my good friend Greg, W6IZT. You probably recognize this fella, SM5AQD. This is one of our team members. His name is Hawk. Craig, the fellow sitting in the chair there, K9CT, is quite an enthusiastic supporter of flex radios and was instrumental in getting them to become one of our sponsors. And here we are. This is a fairly typical scene, most of the day and most of the night. I thought these numbers might be of interest. Our call sign was 3G9 Alpha, of course, stroke Maritime Mobile. And this is a listing of the QSOs by operator. And you'll note in the lower right-hand corner that we had about 10,000 QSOs altogether. About 3,700 QSOs on 40 meters, 7 megahertz. A little more than that, 10% more, 4,200 or so on 20 meters. And then on 15 meters, which was very encouraging to us to have 15 meters open, about 1,600 QSOs. You'll also note to the left-hand side of this chart that FT8 amounted to about 27% of our QSOs. 3 meals a day, although they were not always well attended. depending upon what was going on outside and the motion of the boat. This is the kitchen right next door. The food was fabulous. The first 4 or 5 days as we traveled eastward and exited the Straits of Magellan, traveled on an easterly course, we passed south of the Falkland Islands. We had calm seas, surprisingly calm. We encountered these mammals. They're called the Commerson dolphin, and I'm just reading from Wikipedia here. They have sharply delineated black and white patterning, and they are found around the tip of South America. I'd never seen anything like this before. You know, I love sunsets, and here's one of the beautiful sunsets that we had en route. We didn't have a lot of sunsets when we got to Bouvet. They were obscured by clouds and wind and rain and snow and sleet. A wandering albatross. I would guess that the wingspan here is somewhere between 6 and 8 feet. I want to show you a couple of pictures of some of the guys, give you an idea of who was on the team. Arnie, the N6HC. Arnie's a physician. Jim, N9TK. Jim has been on 4 or 5 DXpeditions in the past. Hal, JR4OZR. Heck of an operator, heck of a nice guy. Pista, you probably know Pista, HA5AO, a DXpeditioner of some note in his own right. Mike, PA5M. Mike was on with us on Peter 1 some years ago. Eust, LA9 Delta Lima. Craig, K9CT. Keith, first time I traveled with Keith, V7KW. This is Paul, first time we traveled with Paul. Jeff, NM1Y. Has only been licensed about 4 years, and here he is on a DXpedition to the number 2 most wanted. Jerry, WV9Z, great guy, great friend. And Hal, W8HC, first time Hal and I have traveled together, and I enjoyed his company as well. There's another picture of Alejo, a picture of Glenn Johnson. Glenn and I have co-managed or co-led a number of expeditions in the past, and consider him a very good friend. And of course, same with Ralph, K0IR. There's Hawk again, SM5AQD. That's me. And there's a good shot of Erling, LA6BM. George, who lives here in Atlanta, N4GRN. And another Atlanta native, Greg, W6IZT. And there's no deer. Good shot with that camera around his neck, ready for anything that needed a photograph taken. So here we are then, just north of South Georgia. We encountered whales, saw them every day. Some of them up close. As we got past South Georgia, and particularly as we approached the South Sandwich Islands, the seas began to, build. The wind was building. We were beginning to encounter some of the storms for which the southern 40s and 50s are well known. And this particular video was taken out of the porthole. You can see that the porthole's maybe 4 or 5 feet above the level of the ocean. And this gives you an idea. Those seas are quite confused, unpredictable. Again, some more shots this time looking after the vessel. Here we are, South Georgia, and at that point we began to see a lot of icebergs. And if you've ever seen one of these up close, you know it's an amazing, amazing sight. So here we are approaching Bouvet. This is the night of the 30th and the morning of the 31st of January. Remember, we left on the 19th, so it took us 12 days to get there, and that's pretty much what we had estimated. Here's what we found. Very reminiscent of what we saw at Peter 1. It was really about 36 hours before we could fly our helicopter onto Peter 1 to do a recon trip and find our camp locations. So we kind of expected this. Now you see in this shot that it's cleared up a little bit, but there's still fog or rain or a snowstorm or something there on the glacier or above the glacier, obscuring where our campsites were likely to be. And the problem here is that the helicopter pilots have difficulty determining the difference between white clouds or a snowstorm and the glacier. It's one of the things that makes flying in that kind of situation very hazardous. Now these next shots here, if you look to the left-hand side, you'll see that there is some kind of a weather situation developing on the left, and it's slowly, as these shots, you see it's moving across the island. Again, when the pilots, helicopter pilots see this, they immediately go back to their room and say, "We're not flying today." So we had numerous meetings with the helicopter pilots. It became obvious to us that they were, for lack of a better term, spooked by the weather itself, by the infrequent and short flying windows, the large amount of stuff that we had to get ashore, 14 radios and amplifiers, about 20 antennas and masts, 8 6.5 kW generators, 5 shelters, 23 men, food, water, gas, and personal gear. They were also spooked by the wind and by the roll of the boat. Here's some shots that we're taking during some of those meetings with the helicopter pilots. Again, Alejo on the left and the pilots on the right. So we modified our plan. We reduced the size and the scope of the planned operation. We reduced the amount of stuff going ashore. In other words, we adopted what we call an MVC approach. MVC stands for Minimum Viable Configuration. This is what we did for our Navassa operation in 2015, call sign K1N. We managed to get all of the people on that team, all of the food, all of the radios, all the amps, all the generators, all the fuel that we needed from Jamaica to Navassa, a 1-hour flight with only 6 helicopter flights. The bare minimum, but enough to get the job done. That's the strategy behind the MVC. And we were going to stage on now. We were going to start with a few guys and a few radios and a few antennas, and then as weather permitted, add to that. More guys on, more shelters, more radios, more equipment, antennas, and so on and so forth, and then reverse the process when we were to begin leaving the island. So staging on and staging off was part of the new plan. And then Ralph, K4UEE, briefed the team. In the forward hold of the vessel were all of the shelters, the floor sections, the shelters themselves, also the tower sections for the 260-meter verticals provided to us by DX Engineering. We were using our time while we were waiting for a weather window, a weather opening, so that we could begin flying. We practiced erecting one of the shelters. About half of the team had done this before, but half had not. So it was quite important that we practice this, because once you're on the island and the weather can change so quickly, you want to be sure that you're not wasting time getting the shelter up. Meanwhile, outside, the wind blew and blew. Now, here's some photographs that were taken on the third day, and we'll talk more about what happened on the third day. But here's some shots that were taken, most of them by No Deer, and you get a pretty good picture of what this island is like. If you were to be on that beach and look up, you'd probably see 100 and 200 feet of snow towering over you. Not a particularly safe place to be. Pretty spectacular place, but in many ways frightening. Now let's talk about February 2nd. Remember, we got there early in the morning of the 31st of January. So 2 days later, February 2nd, the clouds and the fog moved in all day. And then around sunset, the winds picked up. Gale force plus winds were predicted for the next 4 days. and the captain found that even 2 anchors could not hold position of the vessel. Here is a weather forecast. If you look at the column there, the third column to the left-hand side of this chart, you can see the speed and you can see the gust estimates. I'd have you look at February 4th at 0600, gusts to 75 miles an hour predicted. At 0900, 65 miles per hour. 57 miles per hour, 51, 60, 62 miles per hour. Those were the forecasts that we were facing. And here's some shots that were taken during what was going on outside in the building preparation for what turned out to be a very, very bad night, the night of the 2nd. So we had an intense storm. The winds hit 80 miles an hour. That's hurricane force. And we couldn't find any place to hide. There was no lee shore. Then, about midnight, again February 2nd, while under power trying to hold position, a coupling on the starboard engine failed. The passenger cabin filled with smoke. We donned our life vests and assembled on deck at the designated spot. We soon learned that there was no fire, but the rubber coupling had overheated, it had failed, and caused the smoke. Here's some shots that were taken that night. Again, this is about midnight. Got dressed, we got our life jackets on, and we assembled just as we were supposed to, just as we had been told to do. Well, February 3rd, the next morning, we awoke to a beautiful day. However, there was concern that if the second engine failed, we may run aground or we may encounter icebergs. You see, at that point, we didn't know what the problem was with the first engine. The question is, what if the team had been on the island or had not been on the island, but we took advantage of that great weather? Was extraction impossible? Probably. So the captain declared and had really no choice but to abort the mission. So the Betanzos headed back to Chile. There was a replacement coupling. In fact, it was the original coupling because the one that failed was a new one. But they kept the old one. They put it back on the failed engine. We headed west towards home. We're using 2 engines now, but very cautiously. But due to headwinds and oncoming current, we crawled along for 2 days. We estimated it could be 3 to 4 weeks to return to Punta Arenas. Then, the replacement coupling failed also. Now, 1 engine left. We're out of options. The captain decides to head to Cape Town. That way we would be downwind and with the current. So we headed north towards Cape Town and away from the ice fields. This is a picture of our tracker, and you can see where we're heading away to the left. That would be west towards Punta Arenas, Chile. When that engine failed, the decision was made to go to Cape Town. This was on the 5th of January, and we arrived in Cape Town, I believe, on the 17th, so 2 more weeks on the boat. But the weather began to improve, it got a little bit warmer, and we used the time to take some photographs. Here we are with flags representing the 8 different countries that were represented on the team. And then on the 16th, we're about 100 nautical miles from Cape Town. So as you might imagine, we were looking forward to dry land. And this is one of the first shots of the Cape Town area. Finally, the harbor was there on the 17th. So you might ask yourself, how did we feel? Well, some were relieved and some were disgruntled. Maybe that's too strong a word, but anyway, this picture kind of shows it. And then about a 35-foot sailboat approached us, and on the horn was going CQ. Well, it turned out to be a vessel owned by one of the members of the South African Radio League. The fellow on the left there waving is ZS1AU. He's probably the most famous radio amateur in South Africa, maybe in the continent of Africa. His name is Dennis. The fellow waving at us is ZS1S, Paul. And again, this lifted our spirits. And the next day, The club threw one heck of a party for us at the Royal Cape Yacht Club. It was quite a shindig. That's an American term for a big party. And I used the opportunity to present them with one of our two Bouvet flags. Each of the team members signed the flag, and we made a nice presentation. I just included this picture because I thought the four team members here that pictured, if you look at their faces, they look rested, they look happy, they look safe, and they just kind of looked a little different than they had looked in the last month or so. Well, let's spend a few minutes talking about the due diligence process. How did we choose these people and that vessel, and what did we do to best we could make sure that we wouldn't have a problem like we had? It's interesting and important to note that this is the same transportation company that we used to take us to Peter 1. When I contacted them a couple of years ago, they had just bought a new old boat. In April of last year, George, N4GRN, and I flew to Punta Arenas and did an on-site inspection of the vessel. At that point, it was in dry dock. And all of the plans for renovating the vessel and changing it from its previous purpose to its new purpose, developing Antarctic projects, was explained, and the budget was explained, and the plan was to spend about $2.5 million in that renovation. On July 1st of last year, we signed a contract, gave them a deposit, and we included in the contract, first time we'd done this, a questionnaire or a checklist to be sure as best we could that the vessel was fit for purpose. In other words, it would meet our requirements. In September, when we had our team meeting here in Atlanta, we had a Skype call with the representative of DAP. The team had an opportunity to ask some questions. We had telephone or Skype calls at least every 3 weeks in an effort to get updates on the vessel renovations. George, N4GRN, myself, and K4UEE were usually on those calls. We found that the renovations were being delayed. We were concerned about that, and we raised those concerns often. But there was always explained to us that, a reason that there had been a delay, and it always made sense to us. If everything had been on schedule, they would have had 3 missions before ours, which I think is interesting to note. We had email communications often. In mid-December, about 3 weeks before our departure for Punta Arenas, we received the 120-question fit-for-purpose questionnaire back, and we looked it over and were satisfied with all the answers. We had a teleconference with the captain of the boat, who we'd never met. And again, we talked about the delays, the fact that they'd come from contractors or supplies. There was the entire interior passenger department that you saw pictures of earlier in this presentation were built in Punta Arenas, but were not supposed to be. In fact, all of that was supposed to have come from China in a prefabricated fashion. They were supposed to arrive in September, and in the middle of December, they had still not arrived. They had weather problems. They couldn't paint the vessel because of rain for 2 weeks, and they couldn't launch the vessel because they had unusually high winds and unusually low tides, but it all made sense and always explainable. All the inspections, certifications, and permits were received prior to departure, although it was 6 days later than we had originally planned. Here's a copy of the fit-for-purpose checklist. You probably cannot read that, but you see it was quite extensive. Here's a copy of the safety certificate that was issued by the Chilean Navy. In Chile, the Chilean Navy is the maritime authority. This certificate is current to 2022. It confirms that all items and systems on the vessel were tested and approved. You're looking just at the front page, but it's a long document, 8 pages, and after each of the inspections, there is a sign-off with the name of the inspector and so on and so forth. This included the engines, the shafts, the clutch, the propeller, the electronics, the communications, the hull, etc. And this is the authorization for departure. This document is required before departing port. Betanzos was cleared to sail to Zona Subantarctica Atlantico Sur. And that was signed on the 19th of January, the day we left. So what are the lessons we learned? Well, we learned that Bouvet is a very dangerous place. We learned that there's never good weather on Bouvet, and that the weather windows available for flying are very short and very infrequent, different than Peter 1. We had opportunities at Peter 1, although it may have been several days before we could fly. We would have 4 or 5 hours of flight time. Here, I think the longest period that we saw was maybe 2 hours. So the windows are shorter and more infrequent than they were at Peter 1. The seas around Bouvet are wild. There's no shelter. There's no lee shore. No place to hide. I think in the future we need to adopt the MVC, minimum viable configuration, like we used on Navassa. And we learned, too, that a good team is absolutely essential. No sissies allowed. Next time, maybe. 87% of the current team says yes or maybe to another try. But can we find another vessel? Can we find another helo? Can we find new team members that are able to pay the big price and have the time? Can we find the money? Decisions that need to be made. Can we downsize to allow for shorter, quicker weather openings? Can we get lucky on the weather? Maybe go 4 to 6 weeks earlier. That might help. Smaller footprint on the island, 1 or 2 shelters, a smaller team, fewer stations and antennas. But the big question, is it worth the money? Is it worth the time? And is it worth the effort? Also, what about Dom, 3Z9DX? Will he be successful? What about the timing for a second attempt? No attempt is possible for at least 18 months. That's too long to hold contributors' money for a second attempt. So, we're going to offer a refund of the balance in our accounts after all expenses have been paid. When will that be? After the container is returned to Atlanta and we have paid the bill? After all the equipment that has been loaned to us by our various sponsors is returned to our sponsors, and after all the bills have been paid? How are we going to do it? Well, the current plan is to have a link on our website that you may go to that link and request a refund on a form that's online. And we believe that there'll be several options. One option obviously would be, yes, I want a refund, and I want it via PayPal. We'd prefer not to be writing checks. So we're going to ask if you want a refund that you give us a PayPal email address. Or another option might be, I would like to direct my refund to the Bouvet team to help them offset their considerable expenses. Another option might be, I'd like to direct my refund to Northern Cal DX Foundation or Indexa or other DX foundations like German DX. If you do nothing, your unclaimed refund will be directed to the DX foundations. At this point, it's appropriate, I think, to thank everyone that has supported the Bouvet DXpedition, our major sponsors, Flex Radio, DX Engineering, HamCom, 403A, NCDXF, Indexa, German DX, ARRL Colvin. It's important to note that in total there are 137 DX clubs or foundations that have supported the project and 3,700 individual DXers. Again, many thanks to Flex Systems and their support and their confidence in us. Thanks to DX Engineering as well. And now I'd like to spend a moment and give you some of my personal observations. Our contract called for up to 21 days at the island. That would allow us 10 to 14 days on the air. In other words, we were well aware that the weather would be bad and that the weather windows, the opportunity to fly, would be limited. But if we could get 10 to 14 days on the air, that would be enough to accomplish our mission. I've got to point out we were only there for 3 days, not 21. If not for the abort, we would have gotten on the island, I think, and we would have made QSOs. But it might have been a smaller operation than originally planned. I think it's important to point out that, in my view, the engine failure was not the fault of DAP, but instead a contractor. And the last I heard, DAP was pursuing litigation against that contractor. So we'll see. Before I leave you, I want to leave you with some words to live by. When I first saw this quote from Richard Bode, I thought to myself, boy, that really, really strikes home. And this whole quote of his has been kind of a motivation for me, maybe an explanation of what motivates me. So I just want to share it with you. From the entire 3Y0Z team, 73s, and thank you for your continued support.